The Ukrainian war has almost certainly identified one of the key facts that, well, what should we say, one of the fundamentals of what Brexit was meant to be about. That it was meant to be about Britain sailing away from Europe. It could just ignore Europe, and the needs of Europe and the concerns of Europe were not that of the UK. They had an entirely separate concerns when it came to security, regulations, trade, etc., etc. But all this Ukrainian war has done has highlighted the very folly of Brexit, how foolish it was. The idea of, quote, sovereignty when it wasn't. We had sovereignty all the time. Most of the rules and laws people can't even name, even now, And this article that we're going to get into says it very clearly. This guy talked to some Brexiteers, and even they say Brexit has been a complete disaster. They just daren't say it out loud yet. And as I always said, this is exactly the way we saw the Iraq War. People were overwhelmingly in favor of the Iraq War. Polls even suggest that to be the case. But after, you cannot find anyone who was a supporter of the Iraq War and says that it was a good idea to do, despite the fact that, again, you have polls back from that time saying that overwhelmingly people were in favor of it. It is going exactly the same way, and slowly but surely the worm is starting to turn. So, as always, before we do go jumping into this, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you to all those people who do support the channel that way. And of course, thank you to all those people who also just hit the like and share buttons as well. Like I always say, every little helps. So on with this. This comes from The Guardian with the title of "War has highlighted the geopolitical folly of Britain's departure from the EU." The Australian comedian Bill Kerr used to begin his BBC appearances with, "I don't want to worry you, but..." And funny how those words have come back to haunt me last week as I watched the television coverage of the criminal bombing of homes in Ukraine. Some of us are old enough to remember Hitler's bombing of London, Coventry, and elsewhere. Also, not forgetting the bombing of Dresden and Kurt Vonnegut's book about it, The Slaughterhouse-Five, a very disturbing classic. It was because Europe, and again, Americans' leaders, let alone their people, never wished to witness such horrors again that the European movement began. And now here we are, with a tyrant in the Kremlin repeating such horrific scenes in Europe. Yes, Europe. Putin is the modern epitome of Lord Acton's very famous, well-phrased dictum: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Quite apart from the inhumanity and carnage in his infinite folly, Putin has set off the process of economic and social disruption which compounds the many obvious crises that the world has already faced. As energy prices soar, memories are being revived of the UK back in the 1970s, when the first oil crisis of 1973 to 74 was a major factor in unseating the 1970 to 74 government of Edward Heath, and of course sowed the seeds of the ultimate failure of the Wilson and Callaghan governments of 1974 to 1979. Then the sign, of course, of our egregious Prime Minister, of course, going oil in can, or can oil in hand, shall we say, into the Middle East to dictators to plead for economic help to try and counteract the very damage inflicted by another dictator, Putin, invokes, of course, the very uncomfortable memory when Labour Chancellor Denis Healey was besieged in 1976 by rampant inflation and balance of payment crisis, and the Treasury's top civil servant, my good friend the late Sir Douglas Wass, tried to lighten the mood by saying, "It could be worse, Chancellor, the Russians might be invading." Yes, well, let's hope it doesn't go there. I am sure that when he first had chancellorial ambitions, Rishi Sunak was not expecting, shall we say, to have to cope with the echoes of the 1970s. But here we are. And of course, with inflation accelerating and the chair of John Lewis, Devonshire, a white of a white and highly respected former Treasury officials saying, worrying, of course, about the very rate of inflation, maybe once heading for double digits. True, the inflation has been exacerbated by the shortages provoked by the pandemic, but has also been aggravated by the serious impact on food, not least grain and other shortages resulting from Putin's war. But something else has been driving these prices up all over the place, and yes, that is, you've no doubt guessed it, the mounting impact of Brexit. On which subject I had a very interesting encounter with a Remainer British expat who was visiting his Brexiteer friends in assorted home countries country havens. To his surprise, he found that most of them were admitting in private but could not bring themselves to say openly and publicly that Brexit is a catastrophe. And of course, it has not yet, of course, unseated the chief elected culprit himself, Johnson, because he keeps being let off the hook by other distractions, such as COVID, now apparently reviving, and of course, the awful tragedy in Ukraine. But the war in Ukraine has highlighted the very geopolitical folly of Britain's departure from the EU. It has brought the European nations together and left the UK trailing behind. While the absurdity of global Britain and aircraft carriers being sent to the Far East becomes ever more apparent. Brexiteer Sunak even faces one hell of a task with his spring statement this week, and of course the soaring cost of energy. As in the 1970s, both the inflationary driving up the prices and deflationary is acting as a depressant on the demand in the real economy. Sunak should be telling us that Brexit was a mistake and that a major reconsideration for economic strategy is required. He himself is, of course, very well off, and so are the oligarchs. Johnson and co. used it to try and cultivate and unite the popular tide against them. And many people are not so fortunate. And as Francis Bacon said, fortunes come tumbling into the hands of some men's laps. And of course, oligarchy in ancient Greek meant rule by a few. Strictly speaking, the men who are referred today as oligarchs are not rulers, but rich men who have plundered the Russian national resources. And as Aristotle says in the Politics, sovereignty, when they tire of tyrants, we exercise in oligarchy by the rich. It is an awful commentary, of course, on the values of Johnson and Sunak's predecessors, George Osborne, that we are here up to their necks in this very scandal that has made London nicknamed Londongrad, the money laundering capital of the world. However, as my mother once said, it will all come out in the wash. And of course, that is the depressing situation we are indeed here today in the UK. And we keep on hearing this. We've seen the narrative put forward by not just in the left-wing media, but in the right-wing media, that Brexit was completely wrong about this. Even the Tory graph had to put out 2 opinion pieces from people saying, oh, Brexit, you don't understand. Brexit has enhanced our position, and we were only able to do what we were able to do because we Brexited, which again is completely false. That, of course, you can pretty much sum that up for most Brexiteer comments. But this is where we go, unfortunately. And this is, I think, where we start to see these challenges now. We've got the entire farming community, a part of the very harried group that was, again, voting, half of them voted for Brexit, now turning heavily against the Conservative Party and very heavily against their ideas for post-Brexit ideas of farming, as we saw in the 2 by-elections down south. Fishermen are now up in arms against what the government has done to see them being thrown under the bus by this. Manufacturing companies are up in arms because they are now finding it increasingly difficult to trade with Europe, their biggest trading partner, of where they get either they buy the materials or they sell their stuff too. The small ones in particular, are just going, we're out. This is just too complicated, which again, as we've said before, less investment, smaller economy, less taxes. This is very, very troubling for this country to see those turns of events being slowly but surely followed down on. And as was said in the article, Sunak should be brave enough to say that this was indeed a folly and that we need a fundamental rethink of the British economy, which again, surprisingly enough, was put forward by, of course, the Levelling Up paper. But you won't be too surprised that when it came to Chapter 3, Rishi Sunak's part, he did not commit to that fundamental realigning of the British economy. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, let me know what you think down below in the comments as well. And of course, down below, there are a link to my Patreon page and an annotation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support the channel that way. And of course, we'll see you all next time.